Good evening and welcome to a special live Sine edition of Primetime Lawmakers for April 14th, 2011. As you see, the Georgia House and Senate are still in session at this hour with adjournment expected near midnight. I'm Scott Slade. Coming up in tonight's program, the House gives final approval to an illegal immigration reform bill. The measure now heads to the governor's desk. The Senate gives final passage to a bill expanding the power of the governor to remove local school board members if the district has lost accreditation. We'll check in with Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report. Tom will be joining in Nwandi Lawson live from the Capitol. And for in-depth analysis of the 2011 session, I'll be welcoming Buddy Darden, a former state legislator and congressman who's a senior counsel to McKenna Long Aldridge, and Bill Crane, a political analyst with CSI Crane. That's all coming up on a packed show tonight. But let's check in now and get the latest in the action. It's still continuing at the Gold Dome, live at the Capitol. Here's Nwandi Lawson. She's standing by with Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report. Hello, everybody.
Oh, hello there, Scott. You know, we do have a lot of rumbling here in the hall, but Tom, not much action, actually, since we last talked during our 7 o'clock broadcast. Of course, we can report, though, that there has been final passage of that broad immigration reform measure.
That's right. The House waited a couple of hours. They finally took a vote on it a few minutes ago. And as we expected, they passed it by a 112 to 59 margin. It's final. It's done. It's on its way to the governor's office.
And still those protesters out in front of the Capitol, what they were calling a celebration to try to kill the bill today, now turning into a candlelight vigil.
Yes, I know there are a lot of disappointed folks out there, and they had hoped against hope, I think, that it might somehow be stopped, but it really wasn't in the cards.
Well, you know, moving on to some other aspects of the legislative session, obviously not a whole lot going on this particular evening, but we can look back at a few things that have been taking place, including the untimely demise of that tax reform council measure. We all were waiting for that to come through all session long, and then, well, it just fizzled out.
It did just fizzle out, and I would say that immigration and tax reform were the two biggest goals of the leadership to accomplish this session. And as we know, Monday night or Monday afternoon, the House basically gave up and realized they couldn't do it this session. Maybe they'll try to do something in a special session later this summer. For a while there, it looked like they might have some rocky going on the immigration bill, but that all got worked out on the last day. So I guess you could say they're batting 500 on those two major issues.
You mentioned the special session. Governor Deal, of course, going for the ceremonial visit to both the House and the Senate a little bit earlier today, and of course speaking to the special session coming up just a few months from now.
That's right. The governor said he would call the special session for August 15th, which means that 4 months from tomorrow, the lawmakers will be back in Atlanta. This will be a special session to redistrict the legislative boundary lines and to redraw the boundary lines for Georgia's 14 congressional districts. Speaker David Ralston said that they will talk to the governor about possibly including tax revision also in that special session, which would certainly make it a very interesting session, I think.
Going to be very contentious either way with, of course, Senate Democrats coming out early saying that the new plan for how the redistricting office is being operated is just unfair in their view.
Oh, yeah, the sparring has already started between the two parties. You'll see a lot more of that between now and August 15th. And I think whatever maps the legislators approve during that special session will probably wind up in court being challenged at some point, too. So a lot of fighting to be done on that front.
Guess we can look towards several pieces of legislation, including this immigration piece, which the opponents say is going to head straight to the courtroom as well.
Yeah, I think so. And it's very similar to an Arizona-style law, which also has been held up in federal court, with key parts of it being blocked out in Arizona. There's some thought that the same thing might happen with this law as well.
So as you're looking back now on this session, it's, of course, bound to wrap up any time now. As we were saying, most of the major legislation, of course, already going through. But what are some of the key points and some of the key messages that this session will be remembered by?
Well, again, it was an uneven session in terms of the major goals that they hoped to accomplish. They did do some things on the school governance part because they passed the bills that would give Governor Deal the authority to remove members of the Atlanta School Board if they should lose their accreditation. They also reduced the size of the DeKalb County School Board, which is a major change there as well. But there really aren't a lot of major accomplishments you could point to. It's more a lot of small incremental stuff.
Of course, a lot of talk about 10th Amendment rights here and states' rights and the passage of that interstate health care compact, some feeling that it's a slap in the face of the federal health care overhaul, that along with some other insurance reform coming through during this session.
Yes, the insurance exchange, or I'm sorry, the interstate compact, you're right. that was put out as an alternative to the health insurance exchanges that are required under the Health Care Reform Act. That's not very popular with the Republican majority here. They looked at this interstate compact as perhaps an alternative to that. I'm not sure how that might hold up in court if it ever got challenged either. But again, all part of that 10th Amendment issues that you referred to.
And of course, there was also HB 47 allowing consumers to purchase health insurance across state lines, something that people said, also those supporters anyway, said it would help with helping to overcome some of that federal legislation.
Yes, that's an issue that's come up several times in the past. The supporters of it say, well, it'll make the state available or able to purchase a wider variety of products, but the critics point out that other states with looser regulations than Georgia might wind up selling some inferior insurance policies here. So that's one we really don't know how that's going to work out just yet.
Of course, probably get to see some courtroom action on that as well.
Yes.
Tom Crawford, we want to thank you as always for all of your insights, and certainly throughout the session. We really appreciate them.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, we're going to send it back to Scott in the studio.
All right, thanks very much, Nwandi. Thanks, Tom. I'd like to welcome back to the program a couple of guys you come to know throughout the session. They'll be with us throughout our special coverage this evening. Buddy Darden, former state legislator and congressman, a senior counsel to McKenna Long Aldridge, and Bill Crane, political analyst and crisis manager with CSI Crane. I don't know if we're managing any crises.
Not tonight, not yet anyway.
Yeah, without the budget to haggle over at the last second, it looks pretty procedural to me. Now, both of you have been in the middle of all this before, and just what are they doing right now? Is it all house cleaning, housework?
Pretty much so. What you've got to remember about all legislative bodies, Scott, is that before it can go to the governor or the executive for the signature, it has to pass in exactly the same form by both the Senate and the House. And once it's in exactly the same form, then it can be signed by the governor or the president in the case of the Congress. However, there are a lot of ripples along the way. You can have a Senate amendment which is agreed to by the House, or the House can agree to a Senate amendment, and the Senate can object, or they can agree, or they can disagree. You can have a committee of conference, then you have a conference report, which is turned out. Then it has to be repassed by both sides. But all you got to do is remember this: is regardless of how you get there, it's got to pass both bodies in exactly the same form. And once that happens, then of course, the executive can sign, and that's what they're doing.
There's also still little local bills out there that legislators have been pulling for this session. And that last hour, you'll see it's kind of who's got the horsepower to get their bill in versus somebody else's. And that's a lot of those little local bills do die,
Right.
because there's 1,200 bills introduced this session. But this is the hour when you determine and you see who's calling in their chips.
The crime fighters in Georgia are going to be very happy. The DNA database bill just passed the Georgia Senate, so they are getting a few things done. I'm curious, what happens if they discover, after all the paper flies that Sine died tonight, that, oh my goodness, there are 3 words that don't match between these 2 pieces of legislation? Is it all null and void?
That happens. It happened to me one time on a very important piece of legislation, and it turned out that, of course, the bill had to be passed the next session. Another thing happens too, occasionally there'll be a scrivener's error, and perhaps you might repeal the wrong law. And that's happened before. And then one time had to call on the governor, and Governor Busby, and say, Governor, we made a mistake, and we're going to ask that you veto this bill because there's a fatal mistake and a fatal flaw. So these things happen, and when you have these hundreds of bills and so many clerical possibilities of things to go wrong, it does go wrong. So we won't know really what's passed and what.
At this pace, too.
Yeah,
because it's so
at this
slow at the
pace.
front of the session, and then it's jam it all in at the end, which causes mistakes.
Well, one of the things they didn't argue about much about this time around was money, when you get right down to it, because there wasn't that much to go around, was there?
There wasn't enough to go around, and basically everyone had sort of understood that there was going to be pain to be shared across the board, other than the tax bill to reform Georgia's tax code, which there's plenty of argument about. Everyone seemed to understand that their budget had to get smaller, whether we're talking about education or pre-K or Medicare or Medicaid. Everybody understood this was a year that there was going to be shared pain.
That's right, Bill. And the primary purpose of the General Assembly meeting, anyway, is to pass the budget.
Right.
And once they did that, then everything else is it's important to the individual sponsor. But generally speaking, once you pass the budget, then your work is essentially done.
One of the most important things they say for the last day, immigration reform, and that has indeed passed. It's going to go to the governor to sign it. You think he will?
I don't think he will.
Really?
Well, I think that there's an enormous amount of pressure both from the agricultural and business communities that are still concerned about how this E-Verify and the data that it manages is going to be put in place. And admittedly, there's a failing on the part of the federal government to administer and enforce existing law. But whether the state has the resources to step in or not, and whether a lot of businesses, particularly the agricultural sector, will be harmed, I think is remaining enough in question that Governor Deal may at least pocket veto and not sign that.
I think he's going to take a long, hard look at it because he's in a situation as, you know, the centerpiece of his campaign, or at least a very strong part of it, was immigration reform and doing something about the situation. So he's going to have to look at it very carefully and make up his mind. Now, I was very interested in if this bill does pass, the real hero is going to be a state senator from down in Ocklawaha, Georgia, down in Thomas County, by the name of Senator John Bullock. He's chairman of the Agriculture Committee, and he has inserted quite a number of loopholes and exemptions in the bill that you could probably drive a South Georgia log truck through.
Particularly as it relates to migrant workers who are guests here in the country for the picking season, as they call it.
Well, the governor did not weigh into the whole thing as it went along. He said, I'm not going to give you any advice on this, but he did note that there is a federal court challenge to the whole idea of requiring private businesses to do anything, especially with E-Verify. So
well,
we'll see.
It's hard to, on the one hand, say you can't require federal law can't require employers to have health insurance, and on the other hand, but you can require them to use E-Verify. I mean, it's basically a mandate's a mandate.
And what does sine die mean?
Sine die means without a day. In other words, they're over.
Clock's done.
Clock is done, and usually any legislative body has to fix a time to which to adjourn. But when they adjourn sine die, then it's done. Now, as you know, the Constitution requires that the legislature meet on the second Monday of January every year. So that's determined by law. And of course, we'll have the special session, as we've been discussing, which I don't want to get too much into that right now, but that is going to be a knockdown, drag out. We get an additional member of Congress from the state of Georgia, as you know. And however, there are a lot of very capable, I might add, ambitious legislators who would like to move up to the United States Congress as well. So you're going to see
we will
a
talk
lot of
about
action.
that further this evening and what they're going to try to perhaps kludge onto that special session. I want to head back to the Capitol right now. Things are still happening, and Nwandi is now joined by Marcus Downs, Director of Government Relations for the Georgia Association of Educators. And Nwandi, what to do about teacher pay has had a lot of discussion before the Assembly this year.
I'm sure that was of interest to your organization, the Georgia Association of Educators. Scott, they're talking about the teacher pay, obviously, as an issue. And I'm wondering, overall, how do you feel that educators have fared during this legislative session?
It's been quite an interesting legislative session in terms of education. There have been quite a few bills that scared us, to be quite honest. A parent trigger bill, which was filed and didn't see any movement at all. There was a voucher bill, of course, that was also filed, and that bill was tabled. But then there was also a bill, a RIF bill, that would have established an opportunity for locals to use as one of their criteria the performance of educators into determining how to reduce and force. That was an issue of major concern, particularly since there's no universal tool used to determine how teachers are performing. And one of the things that we at the Georgia Association of Educators would much rather have seen is a little bit more caution in terms of waiting on that evaluation tool so that we could determine what comes out of Race to the Top. We believe with Race to the Top monies, we might be able to see a little bit more even product, and we think that would have been a much more prudent way to move forward.
A lot of the legislation that did address education this year was in terms of Race to the Top, and I know that you mentioned that the Georgia Association of Educators initially not supporting that. However, now you're on board. What do you think about the legislation that's going through, though, that would look at how that we meet the criteria for that?
Well, as you said, we did oppose Race to the Top initially, and we opposed it because we weren't a party to the discussion. Anytime you've got an organization that represents as many educators as we represent, we definitely believe that our opinion and the opinions of our members and the people who teach our kids every day is definitely valuable. Now that we do have the grant, we want to be as supportive as possible. We want to make sure that we move forward supporting the state in any initiatives that it wants to do. But one of the other things that's very important to us, again, is that we're at the table, that we're able to bring some of the expertise that we bring not only as a Georgia association, but as a part of a national affiliate who has access to research and different initiatives that have been implemented from all over the country. We know what works, we know what doesn't work, and we bring a lot to the table.
One area that teachers did retain some monetary incentive is in the area of highly qualified math and science teachers. They maintain their money in the budget. What about other teachers?
Well, you know, and that's been a point of contention for us as well. We certainly appreciate our math and science teacher. I was a science teacher, and but you know, you can't dismiss what our history teachers, what our special ed teachers, what our language arts teachers, what they bring to children as well. Education is supposed to make a child well-rounded, and math and science are indeed critical. However, there are other areas that are also equally as important for the child's development, and at GAE, that's one of the things that really drives what our members work for. They drive to make sure that the child is completely well-developed.
All right, well, Marcus Downs, we thank you very much. Appreciate your insights from the Georgia Association of Educators.
Thank you.
All right, back to you, Scott.
All right, thanks very much, Nwandi. One of the hot button issues surrounding education, while we figure out, how to come up with more money for it, is this whole idea of extracurricular activities. A bill got through one house, another house is considering on kids in magnet schools, home schools, charter schools, that sort of thing, being able to participate in extracurricular activities at their local public high school. It seems to be miring down in the House here at the last minute.
It does, and it's a little troublesome when you look at it, because you've either got to go to one school or another, and to say that for one purpose you can be homeschooled, and for another purpose you can go to a public high school and they be required to take you, that seems to be a bit incongruous, and I think the legislature is having a pretty serious problem with it. And the last I heard, of course, who knows what's going on right now. Last I heard, it was mired down and had not passed.
Mm-hmm. This also ties down to something they're not really talking about, but there were a couple of instances in Georgia in the last 2 years where the valedictorian or salutatorian attached to a high school was a homeschooled child, and not ever having attended classes there was going to be the valedictorian with the highest GPA, and it caused at that community at that time, quite a furor. Mm-hmm. So it's raised some bigger issues about what's appropriate in terms of a homeschooled child affiliating or taking some, picking and choosing, to Buddy's point, cherry picking the parts of that public school experience that they want to participate in or don't want to participate in.
Some would argue their parents are already paying school taxes, they might as well get a full benefit somehow. So go ahead.
Well, we got a situation up in Cherokee County where the valedictorian attends West Georgia College and never has been to that particular high school. Now, if my daughter were up for valedictorian, I'd be pretty upset about that.
Yeah, some of those families are upset about that.
And you're getting into some very
the rubber hits the road.
Rubber hitting the road right here.
Speaking of education, one of the things that happened this time around, when the section started, there was an awful lot of talk about jobs. Everything was going to go through a jobs filter. Well, not much happened because there wasn't a whole lot of money to go around. The argument that some of these tax breaks, like for Delta, Gulfstream, and even billboards, or even theme parks, would generate more jobs. You could argue that, but I'm curious. HB 186 will allow dual enrollment in high school and technical school. That passed, so we could be getting back to an era. Maybe some of us still remember an era where they actually taught you how to do something to make a living while you're in high school.
Well, and there were apprenticeships, and there were. Mm-hmm. Trade. I mean, it wasn't all unheard of when I was in school in the 70s. There was kids on the college track, and there were kids on the technical school track, and there were kids who planned on getting their high school diploma and going straight into the workforce. That is really rare these days. You really don't hear a significant percentage of the Georgia population talking about the high school diploma being an end-all and moving right into the workforce. So I think, yes, there is a recognition that we need qualified plumbers and electricians and the technical trades just as much as we need folks to go on and be doctors and lawyers and dentists and pharmacists.
Well, back in the dark ages when I attended high school, we actually had shop, and we built a lawn chair. We learned carpentry and learned how to use the various tools, but of course at the same time we had college courses. But this is a small school, and it's a little different situation, but it seems like we're going full circle now.
Yeah.
Now, as far as teacher performance is concerned, Mr. Downs with GAE mentioned it just a moment ago. They're a little worried about how Race to the Top is going to be implemented. Tim Callahan for Page was on this program a few nights ago, talking about how unbelievably subjective the whole process is. Principal may stand in the back of a classroom for 10 minutes to grade a teacher, little list, boom, off you go. And some people argue that we ought to have more of a checklist, more of a student type performance thing, maybe even modeling their students' behavior to see how teachers will do.
Well, you can look at test scores. That is one criteria. But in the private sector, there are things called 360 reviews, where if you were making a private sector analysis, the student, the parent, peer teachers, the principal, support personnel in the school would all evaluate performance, and then you give a numeric score and then you average them. I mean, that's something that's very common in the private sector to determine if a manager, as an example, is handling the people well below them, above them, lateral to them, and it gets a whole lot of different feedback instead of just going to the principal. So yeah, how the measurement criteria is established is key to whether it's a fair system or
Boy,
not.
codifying, that's a tough one though, isn't it?
Well, it's a tough one, and there are some schools out in Cobb County in particular that I would be considered a good teacher because your students are so bright and do so well, and they have so much support from home. But then there's some schools, as you know, you can have the very best teachers, but sometimes you don't have the proper resources and the proper parental support, and those students aren't going to do well. So it's not all about the teacher. The teacher can only do so much. And speaking of the race to the top, by the way, I'm sure you noticed at the federal level, as part of the latest budget compromise, that the race to the top funds were kept in. And so
$4.2 billion.
That's pretty evident that this is going to at least be with us for a few years to come.
So 26 out of 180 Georgia school systems will get a chance to play with some of these new criteria and keeping score in the next few years. That's going to be fun to watch. Let's get back down to the state capitol. The Senate and the House are still in session. Legislators held off on making a decision on illegal immigration reform until the last day. Behind the scenes, House Senate leadership has been hammering out their differences. Let's check in again with Nwandi and Jerry Gonzalez, president of the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials. Galeo.
Well, that's true, what you're saying, Scott. That was one of the last matters, HB 87, that the General Assembly was considering, and of course giving that matter final passage. I want to turn to you. Of course, your organization has been very diligently fighting against this bill. What are some of the repercussions now that it has gained final passage?
Well, there's some very serious economic repercussions associated with this. I mean, there is a threat of a national boycott that is looming. That's very significant for our tourism and convention business. So we need to be cognizant of that, but also our agricultural industry. I mean, our Vidalia onions are set to be picked pretty soon. What happens if the farm workers leave? In Arizona, there was a mass exodus of well over 200,000 people. Can our state afford to lose all the workers that generate $68 billion in our agricultural industry? What about our foreign investment? The Georgia Chamber of Commerce has expressed serious concerns about foreign investment and not wanting to come to Georgia because of the interest or the lack of interest in Arizona. So these are very serious repercussions, economic repercussions that I think the governor needs to consider. Governor does not need to sit on this very long. He needs to veto it as soon as possible, because the more uncertainty that exists out there, that's going to be harmful for our economy. And bottom line is there's also litigation costs that are the state's likely to face.
Now, since the governor did campaign on immigration reform as one of his topics, is it likely that he's able to veto this legislation?
Well, it's one thing to run a campaign, it's another thing to run a state. He needs to be a statesman, he needs to act responsibly and work in the best interests of our state. This bill is not in the best interests of our state. It'll harm Georgia's economy for the short term as well as for the long term.
We certainly have heard the proponents of the bill, certainly today, standing up saying that Georgia, the census numbers point to this state having the largest increase in illegal immigrants, as well as having a 10% of its education budget being spent on children who are not legal in this country. How do you answer some of those claims that really the economic impact is so great here in Georgia?
What part of a $68 billion agricultural industry economic output do they question? So again, there is significant contributions that immigrants are making to this state. I question some of the numbers and the validity of those numbers that they're saying, but bottom line is we need comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level. A state cannot cure a shotgun wound by putting a Band-Aid on it. This bill is not going to solve illegal immigration. It's going to drive immigrants further underground and may drive some immigrants as well as citizens away from the state, because this state will be seen as hostile to foreigners, and foreigners will not come to our state.
You've spoken about boycott as one mechanism that might be used. What are some of the next steps?
Well, the next steps are making sure that the governor recognizes the significant economic repercussions of something like this, and making sure that the governor will veto that rather quickly.
All All right, Jerry Gonzalez is the executive director of the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials. We want to thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
All right. The Senate spent about 45 minutes debating HB 87 this afternoon, with supporters arguing that it's a law and order bill and opponents claiming that the measure is misguided. We'll take a look at some of that debate.
To make an argument that it may be good or bad for business is not an argument at all. Because if you truly believe that, should we stop prosecuting DUIs? Surely it harms the bars and the liquor stores when we tell people they can't drink and drive. That is not an answer. Will we not prosecute people who commit armed robbery next? That might cause problems with the industry that's trying to put up camera systems or security guards. That is not the right answer, folks.
You can talk all you want to about the illegal aliens and what we're going to do, but until you approach the problem of the business of documenting these folks illegally, stealing Social Security numbers, providing false documents, that business is the biggest one of the biggest illegal businesses in the country right now. And until you punish those folks with a long prison term, you're not really doing anything to stop them from continuing to furnish people who jump the stream to feed their kids. Now, that's the reason I can't support this particular motion, because I don't think it's tough enough. I think this is as tough as you can get if you want to get to the folks that are really breaking the law and are providing documents so that illegal aliens can come here.
And of course, you've seen arguments there from those for and against HB 87. Did receive final passage here in the General Assembly today on the way to the governor's desk, as we send it back to the studio where Scott has more.
And Nwandi, did Governor Deal ever really weigh in on this immigration reform debate? I mean, you've been down there. Has he given any indication about how he'd like to see things go, or is he just going to say, hey, let the legislature do what they're going to do?
He actually, yes, very strongly spoke out and said that he was going to let the legislative process take its effect and, of course, would then weigh in afterwards. But we do remember that he did campaign strongly on support of the Arizona immigration reform measure. So for those who are calling on him to actually veto that now, it might be a very tough political measure.
We're going to check in with what's going on at the House and Senate right now. They are still in session. We understand that the House has just moved to recommit all bills to their committees. Can we take a look at that very quickly?
You're agreeing. Chair recognizes Representative Shaw to explain his motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the bill, the indemnification bill for the Spencer Pass, the DOT worker that was killed in the line of duty earlier this year that we all remember, and also the Jarrett Little who organic brain damage so we can make payments to a legal guardian. There was an omission, and the state highway employee was left out of the on line 7, and we've just put that back in. I ask you to agree. Thank you.
Yeah, there it is. They're talking about allowing the state benefits to pass on to state workers killed in the line of duty, just like Trooper Chad LaCroix. That was another measure they brought up.
That's right. It takes special legislation to do that.
This move to recommit the bills to committees, that mean like they just, okay, we're going to pull all this stuff off the floor and start cleaning things up?
That's everything that didn't pass goes back to committee, and it will have to be considered again by the committee before it can come back to the floor. It's purely a housekeeping thing, and as you know, a bill is good for both sessions, 2 years, the entire time.
So it doesn't have to be introduced again.
Does not have to be introduced again, but it does have to be brought back before the committee and then has to be considered again before it can go to the floor. It has to go through the subcommittee and committee, and of course in the Rules Committee as well. Just purely a procedural thing.
One of those things, though, that you do last. So they're getting ready. Well, we got a 30
as you're
minutes
boxing stuff up, as you're getting ready to packing it up and pulling the stuff that's crap out of your desk for the session.
Bill's got it right. It's time to start cleaning out your desk now and send these bills back somewhere, and that's where they'll be, back in committee.
Okay. They're focusing on agrees and disagrees, I'm being told at this point. After that discussion of immigration reform, how that might indeed move forward. I mean, really, when we get right down to it, the federal courts might very well just put a big thumbprint on this, won't they? Could be,
if it follows out Arizona lead. You've got two factors here. One, you've got the situation, how you're going to handle the workers, the guest workers, agricultural workers, and as I said before, Senator John Bullock has pretty much taken care of the agricultural situation, but at the same time, you've got the other factor about what do you do when this person is stopped for an illegal tail light, a relatively minor offense, and then you go into looking at their immigration status. And technically, they ought to look at mine when they stop, just like they do everybody else. And so, of course, that's not going to happen. And as you know, anybody who just goes up and down the roads of Georgia in Atlanta area, you'll see a disproportionate number of Latinos stopped. Some of them, maybe the cars disproportionately in bad shape as well, but it's already a fact now. You see them stopped quite more frequently than others, and that's what they're worried about.
One of the things they did in this, though, in this last minute back and forth, the amendment to the amendment to the consideration of the amendment to the amendment, right, was nail down who is going to be checked. And you have to be, as I understand, suspected of a misdemeanor or a felony before they can.
But law enforcement has a very broad discretion.
That's true.
When they talk about what generates that level of suspicion. Did they swerve? Is a taillight dinged? Is the sticker on the tag off? And I do want to give some applause to State Representative Minority Leader Stacey Abrams, who was playing some pretty deft parliamentarian moves on the floor today or tonight, and had some support on the Democratic side who are in opposition to this
on
bill,
the immigration issue.
Talking about we're voting on an amendment to an amendment to an amendment in the House, which would require unanimous consent. The Speaker ruled from the rostrum that no, we're voting on an amendment to a Senate bill that's being reconsidered on the House side, but we're not amending that, and they're actually, we're voting on something we passed out earlier this evening, so we're not amending it again. But she's a good lawyer, she knows her stuff, and she held their feet to the fire a little bit to make sure that they're buttoned up in terms of what they're passing.
And apparently she's not a half-bad tax lawyer either, because she discovered that kink in tax reform that would have penalized the middle class that wound up upsetting the apple cart on tax reform.
True, but you've got to remember it's all about the votes and who's got the votes. I heard Jason Carter, Sons of Carter, make a wonderful impassioned plea, and he went through the bill item by item, and I think probably got the best of Senator Chip Rogers on every point until it was time to vote. And then it really didn't make any difference because Senator Rogers had the votes and then the bill was passed.
But something both Representative Abrams and Senator Carter have done, they have brought hard numbers to the fight. In fact, I believe it was Senator Carter who went through all the Georgia lottery proceeds, county by county.
And talked about where those tickets are sold and how much revenue comes in and how little revenue goes back out to those counties. The Democratic Party got in the salutatorian and valedictorian of each high school, each county getting a certain minimum, obviously for a number of schools they have another $10 or $20 million for lower income households, and I think very effectively played the role that a minority party should, without necessarily always being combative or just simply throwing a grenade.
Right, it's not enough to throw a grenade, for two reasons. One, it's counterproductive, and second, they don't have the numbers anyway to make that much of a difference. But I think the minority positions in both the lottery bill and in the tax bill were very, very effective. And I think
pre-K because if they won that battle, they basically said you can't do this to the teachers, cutting their salary back. A 4-hour program is not as effective, and showed all this educational.
And they did it with hard numbers and logic, and not just rhetoric.
Yes, but I think Ms. Sandra Deal might have been involved.
Yes, I do believe you're right on that.
Because she's very well respected, a former educator, and I think maybe she had the ear of the governor on that matter as well.
Well, a lot more to do this evening. We'll be back to our panel in just a moment. The bill to allow local governments to hold referenda on Sunday alcohol sales finally made it out of the General Assembly after being around for years. Veto threats by former Governor Sonny Perdue always seemed to hold the measure back. That is until Governor Nathan Deal indicated he would sign a Sunday sales bill if it passed the legislature. Nwandi Lawson is standing by at the Capitol again with Jim Tudor, president of the Georgia Association of Convenience Stores. Nwandi?
All right, thanks so much, Scott. Before we talk a little bit about that bill passing, wanted to let everyone know that HB 500, the measure that Tom and I were talking about earlier in regards to the unemployment extension, you hear the applause there in the hall indicating that that did pass, allowing for some long-term unemployment benefits to continue. And now, Jim, turning to the issue at hand, SB 10, you've been working on this issue for quite some time. How many years have you been working on that?
In one version or another, about 5 years.
Okay, so the significance now, you're very clear to make let people know it's not a Sunday booze bill, but what is it?
It's exactly the same thing that we've been able to do in Georgia for over 14 years, which is allow local communities to vote on whether or not to allow off-premise sales of alcoholic beverages. They've had that right for on-premises for 14 years, and finally we'll now be one of 48 states that allow voters to do that.
Heard a little bit on the floor of the House with concerns about the fact that although it is a local option for people to vote for this, that it would spill over into surrounding cities and counties. If you didn't want to have liquor in your county, people from the adjoining county would be coming in. Well, how do you answer those critics?
Well, you know, I can only tell you where I live, in Newton County. You know, the city of Covington allows that. Newton County has never had an election on this issue. It's what we call local control.
What about the economic impact? What will it look like as far as those who decide to vote this in?
Well, I think the first people that will benefit from this would be communities along Georgia's borders, which for a number of years have seen customers go buy their alcoholic beverage as well as the rest of their purchases across state lines. So I think one of the first things we'll do is start keeping income in our state. And so I would think that if Columbus and Savannah and Augusta and those markets which are seeing markets go to other states, I think we'll keep those sales. Beyond that, we'll just see. It's up to the local communities to make that determination of what they think the economic impact will be, and they can vote accordingly. We just wanted them to have the right to vote.
What about convenience store owners? Will you do what some others who want to see those kind of referenda pass? Will you be actually trying to go out and educate voters about the importance of having this in their area?
Well, I think that the local stakeholders, and that's exactly what we do right now on the on-premise. I mean, you don't see the restaurant association out there. You see the stakeholders, the business people that have jobs in the community, employ people, and they'll be making those arguments, I'm sure, at the appropriate time.
Now, for so many years, there was the threat that the former governor, Governor Perdue, was going to veto the measure if it did pass. Do you think that the momentum this year had a lot to do with the fact that Governor Deal says that he will sign it?
Well, I think just as a beginning point, it for the first time people could vote knowing that their vote wouldn't be wasted. And we've always said all along that we felt there were enough votes to pass it if those votes were held. And both the Senate and the House voted, and the votes were there.
So how early could voters be going to the polls on this?
You know, I don't know. I understand that there are some local elections in November but who will be first? Again, we're a large state, 159 counties, so I'm sure that there'll be vast areas of Georgia that will never put this on the ballot, just as that's the case for on-premise consumption. But for those communities that want, they finally have that right.
All right, Jim Tudor, thank you so much for your time here on Lawmakers. And, well, it's almost the end, right?
It's almost the end in a lot of ways.
All right, thanks so much. That's Jim Tudor from the Association of Convenience Store Owners here in the state. Back to you, Scott.
Thanks very much, Nwandi. Going back live to the House and Senate chambers now. We're counting down the minutes to Sine die. You can sort of tell that we are getting ready here to go. They're on the phone. That's the speaker on the phone there, and they're honoring the pages.
Getting close.
Is that it?
Close.
He just announced it, didn't
the
he?
majority leader of the House for a motion.
Yep. There it is.
Mr.
Here it
Speaker,
comes. Here it is.
I move this House now adjourned, sine die.
On the motion, the motion is adopted. This House is adjourned.
Like I say, we got 23 pages left tonight, still working. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all for a great session. Good job.
There's the speaker running down the aisle, just like Tom Murphy used to do.
That's right. That's right.
Tom was a lot older and a little faster, but yeah.
And I guess it's pretty standard here to throw the papers up in the air and make a mess for the crew to clean up the next morning.
It is and is. Of course, you know, the speaker leaving the stand as he did, it goes back to the common law because the speaker was always subject to be attacked and even stabbed. And
really?
That goes back to English common law when the speaker exits the stand in a hurry so that he won't be attacked.
I thought he was just trying to get out of the parking lot first.
Let me say this about the Sunday sales while I've got
Sure,
a
yeah,
second.
let's talk about that.
Two things I want to point out. That's all I'm going to say. One is I was almost embarrassed about the situation because I predicted on this program in the early part of the session it was a done deal. Well, it turned out it wasn't a done deal by any means, but now it's over. So at least the legislature kept me from being too far wrong. And second, one of the reasons that this bill passed is the very much respected and liked guy named Jim Tudor that you just saw. He has been tireless. He's been a very, very fine advocate. He's one of the most respected members of the lobbying community, and I think that it's a great tribute to him that it's finally happened.
You know, a lot of legislators are almost amazed at how their phones rang on this issue, Bill, probably more than anything else. Is that because it was so easy to get your arms around it?
Well, it's an easy up-down, easy to understand, kind of like the state flag. It has some emotional attachment to it. And really, there's 2 states left, Connecticut and Indiana, who ban it and prohibit it entirely. All the other states that had those blue laws in place have let it go. So we don't like, generally speaking, being considered a backward state. So I think that played into it as well.
It's kind of like a lottery. My dad was always against the lottery during his life. He says, I want to be able to vote on it. He said, I'm going to vote against it, but I want to be able to vote on it. People like to have a say about what happens, a choice.
Well, one of the genius parts about this bill, it gives local communities a lot of leeway to decide. I mean, not only whether or not they're going to allow it to happen if they are already wet, but even the hours.
Yeah, like
and which stores will be open.
Gwinnett County, as an example, has multiple municipalities that subscribe even the on-premise. My daughter lives in Snellville. We'll go after church or go to lunch somewhere. We want to go order a glass of wine. It's got to be afternoon. So there's a lot of powers. You're just relating that they could prescribe it to later part of the day. They could prescribe geographic zones. There's a whole lot of flexibility at the local level that retained in this law.
That's right, and the local officials can even decline to hold a vote if they want to. So it's local control in its purest sense.
And wasn't there a local official in North Georgia Mountain County, I don't want to speak out of turn, I think it might be Union County, where package sales are actually legal, but he is not ever allowed a license to be granted because it's the sole commissioner.
That's local control.
That's local control, it sure is. In case you're just joining us, Sine Die has just occurred. Both the House and the Senate have adjourned. The House has given final passage today to tough immigration reform. The Senate has given final passage to a bill that expands the power of the governor to remove local school board members. The House has voted to extend unemployment benefits at the very last second. There's an awful lot that's been going on today. But again, when you get right down to it, a lot of the big stuff was settled early.
It has. I do want to make one prediction, and this is a very dangerous thing to me to do on this show. And nobody likes to be told their baby is ugly, but I'm going to predict that Governor Deal is going to find an ugly baby. That is a billboard bill where they cut the trees down in front of the various billboards. I went through South Georgia recently, and there are lots of billboards that didn't have anything on them. They weren't blocked, and I just really think that I'll be very surprised if Governor Deal signs that bill.
You about to say something?
Well, I don't know that I find that bill to be one of the least attractive. There were several duds in the session, the tax reform bill in particular.
Well, the deer slaughter bill.
The deer slaughter bill.
The baiting bill.
I was going to revisit.
Or the baiting bill, as
the baiting bill is funny. I was going to revisit for a minute the education reform and how some things that happened that didn't happen necessarily at the Capitol. But, for example, Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed, who's made a push to get more involved in the Atlanta Board of Education's antics, saying basically whether the law gives him the authority or this governor the authority, as long as it's someone to step in and do something. And you don't, often, even with the proximity you can see in the graphic behind us of City Hall and the Gold Dome, you don't see them aligning philosophically that often. So for this mayor to say to this governor, it's okay if you do it or I do it, but we need to do something, I think that was a pretty significant behind the scenes. And this speaker, David Ralston, has developed a very cordial relationship with Mayor Kasim Reed, who's a former state senator. And I think, again, that bodes well for Atlanta and the state going forward, that those relationships are a little less chilly than they have been for decades.
Is there going to be a constitutional examination of that? Because, after all, school board members are supposed to be elected.
I'm frankly troubled by the principle, but I think there's probably an overriding factor here that something needs to be done to get everybody's attention. And I think a major shot has been fired across the bow. Of course, assuming that the governor does sign it, then it'll have to be approved by the Justice Department. Voting Rights Act will govern
But
this.
when accreditation is at risk, I mean, that's potentially for these larger counties a multi-billion-dollar impact. They lose access to the Hope Scholarship. The teachers can't transfer within systems. The students themselves may not be able to get into colleges without the accreditation. It's not a small thing. So
and the property values overall in the community
decline,
like just look at what happened in Clayton
County.
Yeah. We'll get back to some more of that in a moment. In the midst of all the talk about the budget, hope Sunday sales, and illegal immigration this year, it's sometimes easy to overlook issues affecting the lives of everyday Georgians at very basic levels. The General Assembly has dealt with social services through a number of pieces of legislation. Earlier in the session, a bill was passed imposing tougher penalties on sex traffickers and those who entice minors into prostitution. And the Runaway Youth Safety Act achieved final passage today. Now joining Nwandi Lawson live at the Capitol is Linda Lowe, public policy advocate for Families First, an organization dedicated to strengthening families. Back to you, Nwandi.
All right, thanks so much, Scott. You know, Linda, perhaps not getting as much press attention as perhaps immigration reform or something else, but we heard the cheers going up with HB 500 passing just a few moments ago. What is the significance of that legislation?
This was a real squeaker. Almost didn't happen, but just at the last minute, the House and Senate both approved an extension of long-term unemployment benefits for 22,000 workers per month who would have been losing those benefits in July. These are federally funded benefits that will now be available to Georgia workers and will pump about $175 million into the local economies.
So talk a little bit about how families and their issues and the issues regarding children and their welfare kind of fare during this session. It's a tight budget year, and you know sometimes these are the issues that have to get cut.
It was a mix, but actually some things turned out better than they might have. Talk about the budget for just a minute. We went into it expecting a large number of very deep budget cuts that we were very concerned about. In the Medicaid area in particular, we were concerned about the loss of some key services to adults that the legislators decided to restore because they decided it would cost more in the long run not to have emergency dental care, etc. They also restored some money for county health departments, both for their general grant and aid and for some oral health services for young children. They restored funds for the Children First program, which is the gateway to services for children who are born at risk with some sort of difficulty. They actually even funded something new that was proposed, which was the use of express lane eligibility for enrolling children in Medicaid. And what that is an opportunity to use data, information already gathered on the family by a different state agency, through food stamps or other programs for which families qualify in order to go ahead and qualify the children for Medicaid. So that also will help qualify the state for some federal bonus money that they can get for enrolling more children. We were very disappointed that legislators decided they could not find the money to solve a different bureaucratic problem for keeping children on their health coverage. A lot of kids, thousands of kids per month, lose it at the 6-month review, which is really a lot of unnecessary paperwork, and we had hoped to be able to eliminate that problem this year. We're going to continue to work on that.
You also had a couple of pieces of legislation. I know Scott mentioned HB 200 in his intro, and you also had the Runaway Protection Act also passing today.
Exactly. We were very pleased about both of those things. The human trafficking bill actually deals with both the sexual exploitation of minors and others, and also with holding people in servitude for whatever reason. And it will provide some new penalties for the people who are guilty of the trafficking, and will also provide an affirmative defense for young people perhaps who are victimized if they're charged with prostitution, if they can show that they were being held against their will and pressed into service, then that's a defense for them, and it may also make them eligible for some crime victims compensation. So we're pleased about that. The Runaway Safety Act will help organizations that serve youth be able to serve kids who are runaways temporarily without being charged with interference with custody. We will have to contact the parents or guardians or DFACS, but they will at least be able to provide some services for a few days. So that's a really important one. There's also a bill that passed, Senate Bill 172, which will require home studies for all adoptions, not just for the public adoptions, and we're pleased to see that. We think that's an improvement to assist children.
Well, thank you very much. Sounds like you've had a very busy session. Well, after it's been sine die, they've thrown the papers in the air, so I guess that means at least you can take a little break now.
Let me say one thing. We were disappointed about the failure of tax reform. We were really hoping for some tax reform that would provide a balanced approach, not just all this budget cutting, but actually generate sufficient revenue so that the state can make the kinds of investments it needs to make in solving problems, like making sure that kids go to schools that are not overcrowded and making sure that traffic gets handled so people can get to work. So we're going to be looking forward to a better opportunity in the future.
Maybe in the special session. Thank you very much, Linda Lowe from Family First. We're also going to be talking about ethics in just a few minutes, but we're going to send it back to Scott in the studio.
Okay, thanks very much, Nwandi. Sine die occurred about 10 or 15 minutes ago. Papers in the air. The Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor are out of there. Back to our panel here, Buddy Darden and Bill Crane's with us this evening. They had a tough line in this human trafficking, child prostitution thing. First of all, a national embarrassment. Even Sally Quillian Yates, our local U.S. attorney, was bemoaning the fact that Atlanta is one of the hubs for child prostitution in America.
All the big things: guns, child prostitution, and strip clubs.
Yeah, really.
And we can't buy a beer on Sunday in the grocery store.
But it was a very tough line between not decriminalizing teen prostitution and getting help for victims and tougher penalties for the pimps.
That's right. And seeing Linda Lowe, by the way, she's been working down the Georgia legislature since I was there back in the early 80s, reminds me that there are a lot of very dedicated, committed people who work in the Georgia legislature. We call them public interest lobbyists who really, they don't have a budget. They can't take anybody out and
fly
entertain
around town.
them.
Right.
Exactly.
Jim Kolstad with the Common Cause, Heidi Moore who works on family issues and the disabled. There's dozens of them, and they don't get a lot of heralding, but they do a lot of great work.
They do great work, and they serve the state for the right reasons. Mayor Francis Atherton comes to mind, and we could
the
go
Garden
on
Club of Georgia.
The Garden Club of Georgia, sure. And there are a lot of people down there, not just people as they used to say with eel-skin briefcases and tassel loafers, but really some totally dedicated, true believers who make a big difference down there. Yeah.
And Linda Lowe was disappointed that tax reform didn't come through, and maybe a lot of people are. The political atmosphere in a special session when you deal with redistricting, is that the time to bring something up like that?
No. In my opinion, no. We totally agree on that. That's the worst thing you can do is mix tax reform up in redistricting, because I have been a participant, a victim, a beneficiary in every aspect of reapportionment, and I can assure you that there's nothing else that needs to be considered at that session, because that is absolutely cutthroat, and you don't need to complicate
we will be in an election year next year. And this
is that worse?
Well, the Republican Party's not going to raise taxes in an election year. Not that they want to do it at all, but they're not going to do it during an election year. And to Linda's point, part of this reform was about balancing out the tax code, which does require some tax increases, looking at things like stabilizing sources of income, like putting sales tax for the state back on food.
In all deference to Linda, I don't think her concept of tax reform is the same as the majority of the General Assembly about tax reform too. She's looking away to bring in more revenues, and they're looking away to cut taxes. If you look at the breaks they handed out this time, so I would say to Linda that her idea of tax reform is not necessarily the same one that is going to carry the day.
Supply side with lower taxes, bring an incentive for more investment is what the tax reform code they were trying.
Okay, I want to get back to that and in the judicial reform movement in just a moment. Two huge areas that still a lot of furrows to plow. A surprise ruling by the State Ethics Commission last week now allows lobbyist gifts to the staff of elected officials to go unreported. House Speaker David Ralston indicated his aim to fix the loophole, but wasn't sure if it could be accomplished in the limited time left of this session. An amendment to address the issue has been attached to a bill dealing with campaign contributions and public utilities. To check into the status of ethics reform, let's head back down to the Capitol, where Nwandi Lawson is standing by with Bill Perry of Common Cause Georgia, a citizens lobby organization. Nwandi?
Well, Scott, since you did just mention that attempt to amend the bill, I figured we should check in on SB 160. They had, in fact, attached that provision to it. And how did it fare as the General Assembly wound down tonight?
Well, fortunately, it passed with the amendment. The bill Common Cause Georgia stood against from the very beginning. So we look at it as a very bad bill, but a good amendment. And we said earlier that it was like driving your gas-guzzling Hummer to take your recycling and drop it off. It was certainly a good thing to do, but had a bad vehicle attached to it.
So let's let people know who aren't familiar with the overriding legislation. That's the bill that would allow the political or the public utilities, in fact, to invest in political action committees.
Well, for the corporations to contribute to political campaigns, it ended a 35-year ban. And we're only one of 2 states left in the nation that didn't allow utility companies to directly contribute to campaigns. So now there's only 1 state left, and that's New Jersey.
So is this kind of a double-edged sword then? I mean, do you see this as a victory in that the amendment did stay on, or is it really a defeat?
It's a defeat with a small victory. Yeah, I mean, the amendment needed to happen. And public employees needed to have gifts from lobbyists disclosed. That absolutely had to happen. There were several pieces of legislation that it could have been attached to that could have been much better, like Senator Butterworth's anonymous political communication ban would have been the perfect piece. But instead, unfortunately, got attached to a bad bill.
Well, ethics has not certainly been in the spotlight. Of course, your organization has allied itself with the Georgia Tea Party Patriots and others in trying to push ethics reform. But what have been some of the stumbling blocks this year to moving that legislation along?
Well, the leadership just hasn't been behind it, and it's unfortunate. We kept on hearing again and again that ethics was done last year. Let's give the new law time to work. But we saw what it did. We have great disclosure. And that allowed, for instance, Speaker Ralston's $17,000 trip to Europe to be disclosed. The problem is you can still take a $17,000 trip to Europe. We pushed real hard for a $100 gift cap from lobbyists to legislators. We looked at this as a 2-year process. We figured that going into the election year next year, we had a much bigger chance. So they've basically given us a good platform to spend the rest of the year screaming about this, and we think we'll have some real momentum going into the next session.
And Democrats had actually proposed the legislation that you're speaking of now, and of course without getting any momentum. Their SB 248 was their attempt to cap those gifts and to do some other areas of that. But that legislation obviously being sponsored only by Democrats.
Right. Well, and it actually was sponsored, it was a bipartisan bill the year before, started off in the House by Representative Willard, who had over 40 signatures on it, both Republicans and Democrats. So we expect to see good bipartisan support again for it.
Okay, so you're looking forward, I guess, to working this out in the interim and then coming back next session with some more legislation?
Absolutely. The Senate is putting together a subcommittee to study ethics over the summer. We're hoping that that's going to be led by Senator Josh McKoon from Columbus, who's so far in his first session been a real champion of ethics. He's pushing hard and has done the best a freshman can, so we're hoping to continue to see good things from him.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll keep following this as you keep working on it.
Absolutely.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
And Bill Perry is with us from Common Cause. We're going to send it back to the studio.
All right, thanks very much, Nwandi. Well, you know, ethics makes people's eyes cross sometimes. Is it really that big a problem?
Well, I want to make a distinction. You can't legislate morality. You can't legislate ethics. You can legislate transparency. And for all the beatdown the speaker's taken on this trip, it wasn't the speaker and $17,000. His family, some staff. And for all those people out there that think those lobbyist checks grease the skids, the issue was taking a look at high-speed rail. There wasn't a single bill introduced in Georgia to even take advantage of those federal monies other than asking for $22 million for Amtrak to build basically Atlanta a decent station. So all that money was spent to no avail, proving out that just because a lobbyist cuts a check, campaign or otherwise, that they have linkage and get a result.
That's
and I
right.
think you should have strong, transparent disclosure and then penalties for non-disclosure, but you can't tell people who they can have dinner with and who they can accept a fruit basket from and expect them to get the business done of the day, in my opinion.
I don't think anybody can complain about the conduct of the speaker this year.
I agree.
It has been exemplary. I think he has shown true leadership and shown true integrity. Obviously, it turns out that was probably a mistake the way that went down, but in any event, I think he stands up as one of the real heroes of this session. And by the way, I might add, it was no accident that that particular rider that Bill Perry is complaining about ended up on that particular bill.
We're going to have to leave it there.
That's the way it works.
Thank you so much for your expertise throughout the session, both of you.
Glad to be here, Scott.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you
Please
for
come
having
back.
us.
You really make this interesting. Coming up tomorrow, a very special legislative wrap-up edition of Primetime Politics. I'll be joined by leading Capitol journalists and commentators for an in-depth overview of the legislative session. Be sure to tune in to a special live Primetime Politics tomorrow night at 7 right here in GPB. That does it for this year's Primetime Lawmakers. We're Nwandi Lawson. I want to say thank you so much for your work this year. You're just fantastic.
All right. Thanks so much. Great working with you, Scott.
Be sure to tune into our special legislative wrap-up edition of Primetime Politics tomorrow night at 7 right here in GPB. It's Sine, everybody. Have a good night.
This is a GPB original production.